how much I appreciate the invitation to come and speak here. I know that Chris shares my sentiments. We've really enjoyed this week and the gracious reception that we've received. I'm going to read my comments today. Though I will refer to some of the exchange in the Weekly Worker and, in fact, other articles in the Weekly Worker. I hope that they are received in the same spirit of camaraderie with which I've been received. Though certainly Marx is an original thinker, he is also a preeminently eminent thinker, eminent with an I. First, beginning with an I. No dreamer of abstract principles with which to oppose to other principles respecting what ought to be, but rather a Hegelian critic of practice obscure to itself. Marx attempts to grasp capital from within by working through its own highest expressions. And though the fact is scarcely ever acknowledged, it's no exaggeration to claim that Adam Smith is Marx's primary interlocutor, at least in his public writings. If we take the number of times a name appears in Marx's writing, no other appears nearly so much as Smith, whose full name appears in Marx's complete works over 1,000 times. By comparison, David Ricardo's appears less than 100. Indeed, the only interlocutor who comes close to Smith in terms of Marx's explicit address in Marx's own writing is Hegel. And over the course of his writing, especially after 1846, Marx ceases to engage explicitly with Hegel and his epigonies almost entirely. Yet with the mere mention of Hegel, the radical difference in the general perception of the two engagements is clear. For though many disapprove of the affair and most disregard its significance, few Marxists deny Hegel's centrality for Marx. And of course, some Marxists, especially Gerd Lukács, Herbert Marcuse, and Theodor Adorno, made critical contributions to our understanding of Hegel. Yet Marxists have left no comparable legacy with respect to the interpretation of Adam Smith. This is for the obvious reason that few Marxists pause to consider why Marx took Smith as seriously as he did. They deny that Marx engaged with Smith substantively and think rather that he argued against him as a liberal. Liberalism, and indeed the bourgeois revolution in the prevailing Stalinoid conception, being thought a pernicious class project to which Marx was resolutely opposed. Thus, Smith is typically regarded on the left in the same way as the German nationalist economist Friedrich List thought of him, viz. As the patron saint of 19th century British free trade imperialism. Alternatively, and even more naively, the left takes their notion of Smith from 20th century conservatives like Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. Thus, the prominent Marx scholar David Harvey described Smith as a liberal utopian committed to a theology of perfectly functioning markets and the hidden hand, unquote. For both conservatives and Marxists alike, Adam Smith is a spokesman for the rising capitalist class. The main interpretive difference is that leftist commentators tend to sneer when they intone the word bourgeois, as in the phrase bourgeois political economy. In that sneering contempt, even of the resolutely anti-Stalinist Marxist, can be detected that constitutive, ubiquitous Stalinism that occasions the death of the left in our time. Recently, there has emerged a purportedly leftist Smith, unearthed by the Italian historical sociologist Giovanni Arrighi in his Adam Smith in Beijing, published by Verso. In it, Arrighi argues that Smith harbors an anti-urban bias preferring agricultural labor to urban wage labor, that he harbors utter skepticism concerning the efficiency and usefulness of business, and that his overwhelming preoccupation is with the establishment and preservation of the government's capacity to pursue the national interest. This new recto verso Smith is marshaled in the service of Arrighi's claim that one who long appeared as one of the 18th century's leading and most thoughtful advocates for the extension of freedom was in fact a discontented critic of the unnatural developmental trajectory of Britain and Europe more generally, and a strong proponent of the natural progress of opulence that he thought China to exemplify. Smith upheld China rather than Europe, Arrighi maintains, as a model of the kind of market-based economic development that was advisable for governments to pursue. Thus assimilated to the category of 18th century Sinophile, Smith on his account becomes an advocate of benevolent absolutism, meritocracy, and an agriculturally based national economy. And such a Smith emerges as a kind of precursor to the 20th century welfare state thinker Karl Polanyi, favoring, as he does, economic development as a process embedded in and limited by particular physical, institutional, and social environments. Just such institutionally embedded development as Arrighi's Smith favors, according to him, has been taking place in China since before the publication of The Wealth of Nations. For the Chinese path, this to me is the point is that Arrighi's fantasy of development limited by nature and somehow an pure outgrowth of culture, and that should be published by a leftist press is an extremely acute symptom of our time. Just such institutionally embedded development as Arrighi Smith favors has, according to him, been taking place in China since before the publication of The Wealth of Nations. For the Chinese path exemplifies a natural pattern of socio-historical development as opposed to the unnatural commerce and manufacturing-based form of development which Arrighi terms capitalist. Capitalism for Arrighi is what the West pursued to overcome feudalism and has continued to pursue pathologically ever since. Such development, as it has generated, has been based on a large class of possessors of labor power unable to work except by the empowerment and the enrichment of the possessors of capital, unquote. It can only occur by subjecting society, development can only occur by subjecting society and tradition in capitalism to relentless transformation, not only in Europe, but also in those places forced to supply it with raw materials. By contrast, Chinese development has taken a natural course, occurring as it does in and through traditional norms and values. Though he supposedly would have approved of it if such development did not require. Though he supposedly would have approved of it, such development does not require a political economist like Adam Smith or anyone else. Indeed, the society itself has no need to reflect upon itself to achieve its purpose. As Arrighi notes, no 18th century Chinese thinker theorized the contribution of self-interested enterprise to the national economy. Presumably there was no need to theorize anything. Arrighi places Adam Smith in Beijing as though a kind of delighted observer. China pursued Smith's non-capitalist, market-based course to a non-capitalist modernity, supposedly, unwittingly, as a result of its traditional wisdom. Thus, Arrighi Smith is anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist without even having to reflect upon it. At all events, improbable as it may seem, he prefers unconscious development pursued in the national interest by a state bureaucracy embedded within tradition to the restless churning of the restless churning of societies dominated by capital. While this is not a polemic against Arrighi, he does represent an advanced stage of the vulgar Stalinism tending to outright reaction of the new left generation, for the inability to read Smith as emerging out of the high enlightenment of figures such as for the inability to read capitalism as emerging out of enlightenment, out of the enlightenment of figures such as Rousseau, Smith, Kant, and Hegel, is symptomatic of the illiberal rot that has set in irremediably on the left in the late 20th century. Everyone is familiar with the conservative Smith, and undoubtedly it was thought a conservative triumph to have his image put on a 20-pound note. But who on the left today speaks of Smith, the philosopher of freedom and proponent of the labor theory of value? Generally discounted today as pre-scientific, the categories of freedom and the labor theory of value are no less ill-favored on the left than they are on the right. Marxist Smith, by contrast, attends closely to this thinker, both in the history and project of political economy. At the same time, Marx does not reduce Smith to simply a place in that history. But who on the left can say what Smith's significance is for Marx? How many reflect upon why, rather than prognosticating coming crises of the system or giving speeches to working men, Marx spent 3 years writing out the history of political economy before making his final draft of Capital. Though Adam Smith is chiefly associated with the demand for freedom of property and the translation of this demand into a project of creating unfettered national markets and international free trade, that whole project generally lumped under the rubric of the invisible hand, none of that is peculiar to Adam Smith. On the contrary, these were mainstream concerns of political economy taken as a whole from at least the time of Sir Dudley North in the 17th century. Similarly, the character and productive potential of the division of labor, closely associated with Smith's name, Smith's famous pin factory example, forms a subject of reflection and analysis for nearly three-quarters of a century before The Wealth of Nations is published. In writings of in fact, there's a fantastic discussion of the division of labor in the writings of the man that Marx credits with the founding of political economy itself, Sir William Petty, in the 17th century. Now for a bit of polemic. Though he had falsely attributed this view to Platypus, Comrade McNair is nonetheless right to deny that the bourgeois revolution began with the French Revolution. Rather, as Marx knew, it began much earlier, though not so early as McNair imagines in the Italian city-states. And again, though Comrade McNair is correct to point out that Marx's Capital cannot be read without reference to the broader claims about the history before fully developed capitalism, the fact that he opposes this to a Hegelian reading shows that not only he doesn't understand Hegel, but that he doesn't understand the full significance of Marx's treatment of the history before fully developed capital in the work Capital. And this confusion demonstrates the extent to which he himself is complicit in the very new leftism of which he accused Platypus on the basis of his non-attendance at our panel on the subject of bourgeois revolution back in April, though I appreciate his attendance at many other panels. For McNair believes that to pose the question of the need for an emancipatory movement to start from the conquests of capitalism in terms of the conquests of liberalism is, as he puts it, pathological, and lands one up a defender of what calls itself liberalism today. Thus, he claims to know where such an understanding leads, i.e. down the path followed by the Shachtmanites, by Adorno and Horkheimer, and more recently by the British Revolutionary Communist Party, Spiked, and the Eustonites. Leaving his understanding of Adorno and Horkheimer to one side, it is clear why McNair would want to avoid the question of building on the project of freedom in favor of building on capitalist productivity's conquest of scarcity, conceived of as purely technological. As his faith in the communist future rests on what he terms elaborated theoretical reasons for supposing a proletarian will to collectivism, as if collectivism were a negation of what exists. But there are more fundamental reasons for McNair's hostility to Hegelian Marxism, and thus of his incomprehension of Marx's critique of political economy. This derives from his pre-critical conception of philosophy, a field he takes to be divided up into various subdomains called epistemology, ontology, etc. Matters about which humans in all times and places are presumed to speculate to one degree or another, or at one level of clarity or another. But while I maintain here that Marx was a bourgeois thinker in the sense that he represents an attempt at fulfilling the bourgeois philosophical project, I insist that he views this project in terms of a post-traditional conception of philosophy, i.e. a properly bourgeois conception of philosophy, one in which the question of the immanence of the thinker to the object thought, the fact that capitalist society and its problem of freedom and unfreedom pose a distinct theoretical problem of the relation of how our understanding of what it is we're doing politically, for instance, here, bears upon what it is we do to reach there. How successful we are in changing the circumstances that we find ourselves in so as to render them more tractable, more susceptible to further transformation. This problem of theory and practice cannot be assimilated to a pragmatic question of learning by trial and error, of adequating one's concepts to reality to a degree that one hopes grows asymptotically ever closer to it, but never actually makes contact with it. Marx in philosophy in this sense, philosophy particularly in the sense that Marx is doing it in the word capital, is not an observational science. The categories of the critique of political economy are the categories of capitalism, and capitalism is what is described by the categories of the critique of political economy. In that sense, they are categories of their object, and the object is only, in a sense, knowable through those categories. They are also categories of capitalism thinking itself that Marx inherits from political economy. They are, in a sense, capitalist subjectivity itself is under critique. In other words, Marx doesn't go out and look for society somewhere to observe it and then ask himself, do my categories apply? Marx's relationship to Smith hinges on precisely his further specification of this very problem. Since for Marx, Smith has advanced the object to such a point, that is, Smith has conceptualized capital and in a sense theorized the revolutionary transformation of it to such a point that his own approach, i.e. Smith's own approach, is no longer adequate. In other words, the bourgeois revolution and the Enlightenment renders itself obsolete in a sense. Marx's critique of Smith hinges precisely on this, and not on any simple matter of correcting Smith's theoretical errors. For this reason, the divide that extends between the epoch of bourgeois society and capital, between the Age of Enlightenment and the thus far unrealized Second Enlightenment of Marx and Engels, can be illuminated through Marx's relationship to Adam Smith. In exploring this theme, I'll be advancing the thesis contra McNair that rather than sidestepping or criticizing liberalism, in Capital, Marx critiques liberalism precisely in order to achieve it under altered circumstances. To achieve it under the altered circumstances that liberalism itself has produced, i.e. industrial society. Circumstances in which capitalism was, by the very fulfillment of its own logic, bound to overcome itself and issue into socialism, but according to that same logic, exhibited tendencies toward regression and disintegration. In failing to fulfill the liberal project, Marxists do not substitute another proletarian or collectivist project in its place. Rather, they conspire with the hollowing out or disintegration of liberalism, its transformation into its opposite, Bonapartist imperialism, and the liquidation of the individual, i.e. subjective and objective authoritarianism. As Marx writes in 1871, this is about Marx's notion of in a sense, the internal disintegration of capital post-1848. What happens to capitalism when it's ripe for a proletarian revolution and proletarian revolution fails, which he grasps under the category of imperialism. The empire, because he's thinking on the analogy of Bonapartist France. The empire, with the coup d'etat for its birth certificate, universal manhood suffrage for its sanction, and the sword for its scepter, professed to rest upon the peasantry, the large mass of producers not directly involved in the struggle of labor and capital. It professed to save the working class by breaking down parliamentarism, and with it the undisguised subserviency of government to the propertied classes. It professed to save the propertied classes by upholding their economic supremacy over the working class. And finally, it professed to unite all classes by reviving for all the chimera of national glory. In reality, it was the only form of government possible at a time when the bourgeoisie had already lost and the working class had not yet acquired the faculty of ruling. Under its sway, bourgeois society is freed from political cares. The state power, apparently soaring high above society, is at the same time itself the greatest scandal of that society, the very hotbed of all its corruptions. Post-1848, imperialism is at the same time the most prostitute and the most ultimate form of state power. In its full-grown state, bourgeois society, not an argument about the state form that can be changed. In its full-grown state, bourgeois society has finally transformed itself into a means for the enslavement of labor by capital. As Marx never tired of demonstrating, not only did the vulgar thinkers of his own day fail to advance beyond their predecessors, more often than not they regressed behind the level attained by their predecessors. Far from having the benefit of hindsight, and certainly no masterminds of the ruling class, Marx considered the so-called liberal political economists of his age, the age of imperialism, as beneath critique. As he wrote of the foremost among them, John Stuart Mill, with his usual eclectic logic, understands how to hold at the same time the view of his father and the opposite view. When he announces himself as the Adam Smith of his day, we do not know what we should be astonished at, the naivete of the man or of the public which accepts him in good faith. For he bears as much resemblance to Adam Smith as General Williams of Cars does to the Duke of Wellington. Unquote. And again on John Stuart Mill and the regressive characteristic of late political economy in the age of imperialism. Marx has a whole category known as vulgar political economy, which means the inability of liberals to think after 1848, which refers to in a sense, the death and disintegration of liberalism in post-1848 society. Ricardo never concerns himself about the origin of surplus value. He treats it as a thing inherent in the capitalist mode of production, which mode, in his eyes, is the natural form of social production. Whenever he discusses the productiveness of labor, he seeks in it not the cause of surplus value, but the cause that determines the magnitude of that value. On the other hand, his school has openly proclaimed the productiveness of labor to be the originating cause of profit, read surplus value. This, at all events, is progress against the mercantilists. Nevertheless, Ricardo's school simply shirked the problem. They did not solve it. But what are we to think of John Stuart Mill, who after half a century after Ricardo solemnly claims superiority over the mercantilists by clumsily repeating the wretched evasions of Ricardo's earliest vulgarizers? Summing up the intellectual regression already well advanced in the early decades of what Marx deems the epoch of Bonapartist liberalism, Marx caustically remarks, again taking John Stuart Mill as his target, "On a level plain, simple mounds look like hills. and insipid flatness, and the insipid flatness of our present bourgeoisie is to be measured by the altitude of its great intellects." Unquote. For the same reason, Germany never produces political economy, according to Marx. As he wrote in the 1873 preface to the German edition of Capital, prior to 1848, political economy in Germany was a foreign science. Before that point, historical circumstances prevented in Germany the development of the capitalist mode of production and consequently the development in that country of modern bourgeois society. Thus, the soil whence political economy springs was wanting. This science had to be imported from England and France as a ready-made article. Its German professors remained schoolboys. The theoretical expression of a foreign reality was turned in their hands into a collection of dogmas, interpreted by them in terms of the petty trading world around them, and therefore misinterpreted. Since 1848, capitalist production has developed rapidly in Germany, and at the present time is in the full bloom of speculation and swindling. But fate is still unpropitious for our professional economists. At the time when they were able to deal with political economy in a straightforward fashion, i.e. pre-1848, modern economic conditions did not actually exist in Germany. As soon as these conditions did come into existence, they did so under circumstances that no longer allowed of their being really and impartially investigated within the bounds of the bourgeois horizon. That's Marx's second postface to the German edition of Capital in 1873. Germany's modern history began with, and is inextricably bound up with, the age of imperialism, the age of liberalism's vulgarity. Comrade McNair, in his reply to Chris Catrone in the pages of the Weekly Worker, complains that when Chris says what the Second International radicals meant by imperialism was not core periphery relations, saying, "This claim is a commonplace from somewhere in the historiography. The problem is it cannot really survive confrontation with the primary sources." But what McNair misses by his failure to understand that the primary source basis of the claim lies in one of the most well-known of Marx's own writings, which I quoted to begin with in discussing Bonapartist imperialism, namely the Civil War in France, a text studied by any and all calling themselves Marxist in the Second International. And the point is reinforced, as I've shown, by Marx's notion in Capital of the intellectual vulgarity of post-1848 British political economy and of the non-existence of German political economy. Both texts elaborate Marx's argument respecting imperialism, that in the absence of proletarian socialism, life under capitalism does not simply carry on. Rather, capitalism itself disintegrates, and liberalism becomes vulgar and authoritarian. These are not matters with which reference to the dictionary meanings of the words imperialism, authoritarianism, or vulgarity are going to help us navigate. So the issue that I'm trying to sharpen via this discussion of Marxist Smith is not a matter of philosophy in the manner of just everyday thinking, things that people at all times and places have done, where the divisiveness of philosophy is opposed to the unity to be attained through programmatic consensus. If the question is one of changing the world, the philosophical matter of grasping the world in which we find ourselves, a world in which we have already changed and continue to change, albeit to a point where it not only seems like fate, a second nature, but one, as Hillel Tickton has argued earlier in the week, is in fact and seemingly irremediably in an advanced state of disintegration. And as Jack Conrad has pointed out in discussing one of Tickton's talks, all institutions, political parties, trade unions, etc., through which the working class has asserted itself in the past are now rotten to the core. This is not a situation in which it's a matter of simply learning from past mistakes. Men and women, much wiser than ourselves, much wiser than we are or will be, can be, given our historical condition, have understood the past in its details better than we could ever hope to learn from documents. So that, admirable as is the project of historical study, and I myself am a historian by profession, the real issue is one of understanding not how not to repeat the past, but to grasp how The regression through repetition is, to grasp how regression through repetition is our wholly unprecedented condition. To return to my theme, for Marx, Adam Smith's key contribution to modern thought, not the division of labor, not the invisible hand, is his recognition that labor alone is the ultimate, and I'm quoting Marx, labor alone is the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared, unquote. While no one speaks of this aspect of Smith, because precious few actually attempt to think through the labor theory of value, Marx celebrates Smith's achievement as follows. It was an immense step forward for Adam Smith to throw out every limiting specification of wealth-creating activity, not only manufacturing or commercial or agricultural labor, but one as well as the others, labor in general. With the abstract universality of wealth-creating activity, we now have the universality of the object, defined as wealth, the product as such, or again, labor as such, but labor as past, objectified labor. Not only has Smith significantly deepened the concept of labor, the very category value is altered thereby. That is, value in Smith is not merely a measure, but is, at least in the tendency of its concept, a form of wealth. A profound historian of his own time, Smith grasped something essential about the social transformations through which he was living. As British society stands poised on the edge of the Industrial Revolution, Smith both grasps the abstract generality of labor, even as he pushes for the generalization of wage labor. Anything short of the freedom and sociality that living by money brings, Smith can only regard as a kind of slavery. In the heat of humanity's struggle for its own emancipation from feudal unfreedom, political economy had developed the laws of the capitalist mode of production and its corresponding forms of exchange in their positive aspects, that is, in the aspects in which they further the general aims of society, unquote. And for Smith, in a sense, the project of the emancipation of Europeans from their own slavery had reached a crisis in 1776. For Smith, the overcoming of feudalism was nothing short of European laborers' self-emancipation from slavery, as he wrote. In the medieval state of Europe, the occupiers of land were all or almost all slaves, but their slavery was of a milder kind than that known among the ancient Greeks and Romans, or even in our West Indian colonies. They were supposed to belong to more directly the land than to their masters. They could therefore be sold with it, but not separately. They could marry, provided it was with the consent of their master. If he maimed or murdered any of them, he was liable to some penalty, though generally to but a small one. They were not, however, capable of acquiring property. Whatever they acquired was acquired to their master. This species of slavery still subsists in Russia, Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia, and other parts of Germany. It is only in the western and southern provinces of Europe that it has gradually been abolished altogether. That's Adam Smith. As Marx commented, Smith's proclamation of labor's emancipation from slavery was not merely the expression of the conditions and requirements of his epoch, but the expression of eternal reason. The laws of production and exchange discovered by political economy were not laws of a historically determined form of those activities, but eternal laws of nature. They were deduced from the nature of man. The Western European self-emancipation from feudal slavery was a declaration of opposition to all hitherto existing forms of class society, in other words. And in that sense, for Marx, was eternal. Smith lived at a time when the generalization of wage labor was in prospect, and theoretically grasped this prospect as a necessity for the unleashing of mankind's potential. He thus expressed conceptually what for the first time has achieved practical truth in abstraction, as an abstraction in society. Marx. Indifference towards any, this is Marx again commenting on Smith. Indifference towards any specific kind of labor presupposes a very developed totality of real kinds of labor, of which no single one is any longer predominant. Smith's abstraction of labor, as such, is not merely the mental product of a concrete totality of labors. In other words, it's not a generalization from an observation of lots of different labor processes. Indifference towards specific labors corresponds to a form of society in which individuals can with ease transfer from one labor to another, and where the specific kind is a matter of chance for them, hence of indifference. Not only the category, labor, but labor in reality has here become the means of creating wealth in general, and has ceased to be organically linked with particular individuals in any specific form. In other words, in Smith, the category of labor attains to its concept in the world, not just in the text, not just as a concept, but it's attaining its concept because the world is attaining to the concept of labor. Capitalism is the first emergent totality or mode of production in a philosophical sense. It's the first mode of production in a philosophical sense. The first society. Here, not simply because it breaks, in a sense, for a thinker like Smith, and certainly for Marx, applying the word to society, to pre-capitalist societies, is almost like an analogy. Because here, not simply because society breaks with the long history of human collectivity as amalgamations of estates, but because at the core of capitalism is freedom, albeit a freedom generative of its opposite. Not only the fact, but no less certainly its apprehension, represents for Marx a revolutionary and epochal achievement. In consequence of the 17th century British Revolution, feudalism was largely overcome, entailing the dissolution of all fixed historic relations of dependence and production. In consequence, the question of freedom was posed. Already in his 1843 letter to Arnold Ruge, known in English translation as For the Ruthless Critique of Everything Existing, Marx recognized that post-feudal society had become the philosophical object, and that for this reason philosophy had changed. It had become, as he puts it, worldly, in a manner that the American popular commentator Robert Heilbronner could recognize but partially. Marx's Smith was indeed among the greatest of the worldly philosophers. To have grasped this point, Heilbronner would have had to have recognized that as such, Smith was not only in company with Ricardo, but he was not in company with later economists, but more importantly, as a worldly philosopher, he was certainly in the company of the greatest philosophical radicals of his time: Rousseau, Thomas Paine, Kant, indeed Robespierre, and Hegel. Even in 1844, at the beginning of his lifelong engagement with Adam Smith, Marx already recognized him to have made a fundamental breakthrough. The community of men, or the manifestation of the nature of men, their mutual complementing, the results of which is species life, truly human life. This community is conceived by political economy in the form of exchange and trade, society as a series of mutual exchanges. It's precisely this process of mutual integration. Society, says Adam Smith, is commercial society. If in and through the proletarianizing revolution, mankind has not realized its full emancipation, but has instead subjected itself to the domination of capital, Marx and Engels are quick to point out in the Communist Manifesto, capital is not a personal but a social power. Extending his insight into the philosophical significance of capitalism as a society in which every person is in some sense a merchant, Adam Smith further marks his advance over previous thinkers in the distinction that he draws between productive and unproductive labor. In other words, the distinction between doing stuff you don't want to do, or doing work, and doing labor. As Marx remarks, Productive labor in the wealth of nations is defined from the standpoint of capitalist production. And Adam Smith here goes to the very heart of the matter. He defines productive labor as that labor which is directly exchanged with capital. Labor here is no mere moral or religious conception of useful or meritorious activity. It's not the opposite of idleness. Nor does the value it produces arise for Smith from circulation, as with, for instance, the monetarists' exports, which can fetch back money to their nation of manufacture. Nor again is productive labor identified with any one particular type of labor, say agricultural labor supposed by the physiocrats to be naturally fertile with value. Rather, productive labor takes place in and through labor power's ongoing relation to capital, whereby one commodity, capital, that exists independently of the worker consumes the worker's commodity, labor power, producing thereby greater value than one inhered in the consumed commodity, i.e. the value of the labor power. Labor is how this society reproduces itself, though not all who work are performing labor. For those for whom Marx's text represents some sort of sociological or economic analysis, his repeated, indeed ongoing excursions on the history of political economy must seem puzzling, a needless interruption of the exposition. That is, if Marx were simply elaborating his own theory and his own category of how the economy worked, the insertion of lengthy the presence of lengthy insertions respecting such historical details as the nature of Smith's conceptual breakthrough on this or that matter would be stylistically infelicitous, if not gratuitous. Yet obvious as this is, Marxists read this and other passages, notes, and remarks in Marx's Capital as just this, an interruption, recognizing in them at most bravura displays of Marx's polemical prowess or of his historical knowledge, as though Marx had need of refuting political economists who wrote half a century or even a century before he did. They somehow think it comprehensible that he should write 3 volumes on past theories of surplus value, i.e. on the history of political economy. If probed on the subject, Marxists of this sort will claim that Marx's preoccupation with the history of political economic thought, which after all necessitates numerous excursions and a formidable footnote apparatus even in Volume 1, was dictated by proletarian intellectualism's struggle against capitalist mystification. But this not only includes Marx's oft-manifest generosity towards intellectuals of the stature of a Smith, it loses sight of the critical aspect of Marx's capital project, central corpus for the elaboration of the Marxian dialectic. I refer to Marx's dialectical method by which he intends to critically appropriate the project of universal human emancipation that he sees at the heart of bourgeois political economy. Though Marx's appropriation of the categorical apparatus of the labor theory of value, through that appropriation of the categorical apparatus of the labor theory of value, Marx works out in greatest detail what Lukács will later term his theory of reification. One way of putting this polemically, as regards certain 20th century commentators, in completing and rendering scientific the labor theory of value, Marx did not iron out its contradictions, but rather allowed those contradictions to reveal themselves dialectically as they are, as necessary forms of appearance whose actuality must be practically overcome if capitalism is ever to be confined to the dustbin of human prehistory. Marx and Engels are often quoted to the effect that the German workers' movement inherited the legacy of classical German philosophy. What is less understood is that the global proletariat inherited the legacy of British political economy. In his 1864 inaugural address to the International Working Men's Association, Marx identifies the moment in which bourgeois thought came to an end as a philosophical project, an event of world historical significance. I refer, of course, to the passage of the 10 Hours Bill. After a 30-year struggle fought with almost admirable perseverance, the English working classes, improving a momentous split between the landlords and money lords, succeeded in carrying the 10 Hours Bill. The immense physical, moral, and intellectual benefits hence accruing to the factory operatives, half-yearly chronicled in the reports of the inspectors of factories, are now acknowledged on all sides. Most of the continental governments had to accept the English Factory Act in more or less modified form, and the English Parliament itself is every year compelled to enlarge its sphere of action. But besides its practical import, there was something else to exalt the marvelous success of this working man's measure. Through their most notorious organs of science, such as Dr. Ure, Professor Senior, and other sages of that stamp, the middle class had predicted and to their heart's content proved that any legal restriction of the hours of labor must sound the death knell of British industry. This struggle, in other words, it must have sounded the death knell of wealth-producing activity. This struggle about the legal restriction of the hours of labor raged the more fiercely since, apart from frightened avarice, it told indeed upon the great contest between the blind rule of the supply and demand laws which the political economy of the middle class and social production controlled by social foresight, which forms the political economy of the working class. Hence, the 10 Hours Bill was not only a great practical success, it was the victory of a principle. It was the first time that in broad daylight, the political economy of the ruling class succumbed to the political economy of the working class. In other words, at the heart of class struggle is a scientific problem of thinking how the future is possible, of arguing for the possibility of the future. In Capital, Marx undertakes to construct no theory of his own, to generate no categorical apparatus of his own. That is, what he means by proletarian political economy is simply bourgeois political economy more fully realized. This Marx indicates by his very point of departure, the commodity form, which he adopts from the first chapter of Ricardo's political treatise published half a century before, a work that Marx understood as simultaneously a lengthy attempt to appropriate Smith and as the political economic basis of the socialism that prevailed in his own day, whose criticism was Marx's ultimate object. 20th century Marxist theorist Gerd Lukács comments on Marx's approach to the Enlightenment tradition and to political economy more specifically when he writes, in History and Class Consciousness, the survival of the bourgeoisie rests on the assumption that it never obtains a clear insight into the social conditions of its own existence. A glance at the history of the 19th century reveals a profound and continuous parallel between the gradual growth of this self-knowledge and the decline of the bourgeoisie. At the end of the 18th century, the bourgeoisie was ideologically strong and unbroken. The same thing was still true at the beginning of the 19th century, when its ideology, the ideology of bourgeois freedom and democracy, had not yet been undermined. And when the bourgeoisie could still hope, and moreover hope in good faith, that this democratic bourgeois freedom and the supremacy of economics, I should repeat this, hope in good faith. Right? The point is that for Marx, as well as for Lukács, thinkers like Adam Smith and Ricardo are in good faith, which is more than can be said about Proudhon. That this democratic bourgeois freedom and the supremacy of economic, or at least of Proudhon post-1848, and the supremacy of economics would one day lead to the salvation of all mankind. The glory and the pathos of this faith does more than fill the history of the first bourgeois revolutions, i.e. the Great French Revolution. It confers upon the scientific pronouncements of the bourgeois class, for instance, the economics of Adam Smith and Ricardo, their forthrightness and the strength to strive for the truth and to reveal what they have without cloaking it. By the late 19th century, social democracy in the Second International had pushed political economy, and with it the conditions of European labor, far beyond anything Marx could concretely imagine. Like Marx and Engels, radicals in the Second International grasped that the development of capitalism that Bernstein pointed to had to be understood with respect to the growth and development of workers' politics itself. Gains are the reified product of overcoming other reifications, the substitution of bourgeois for proletarian political economy. As the 19th century self-defeat of the British workers' movement in and through its struggles for better wages, hours, and conditions, reveals no less than does the emergence of revisionism out of Marxism's greatest promise in the growth of the German SPD. Even the gains of the workers' movement bears within itself the seeds of its own defeat, just as every revolution thus far has come both too soon and too late. Accordingly, for Marx, the passage of the 10 Hours Bill demanded the critique of political economy in capital. It wasn't a gain that stood as, in a sense, solid and invulnerable. Rather, the gains themselves, the victories themselves, are what call forth the critique, because they have the seeds of defeat within them. To conclude, as Karl Korsch argued decades ago, Marx's critique of political economy presupposes that just as it is constituted politically through liberal democratic revolution and socially through proletarianization, bourgeois society is constituted subjectively through the deliberate striving for comprehension of social freedom and unfreedom, through political economy and in a different sense in modern philosophy and in innumerable other senses in other ways. What Marx would view as the subjectivity of the commodity form, the highest expression of which is political economy itself, was won through revolutionary struggle, at the heart of which lay the modern philosophy that is political economy. To grasp the nature of the freedom that has thus been conquered for mankind, and the unfreedom that this freedom creates, this singularly modern philosophy of political economy, and it has no pre-modern history. There is no pre-modern political economy because it is the, in a sense, the science of capitalism in a double sense. This singularly modern philosophy of political economy must be subjected to critique. Often enough, the subjectivity's emancipatory activity is acknowledged in the heroic liberal narrative of the rise of modernity through scientific revolution and the weakening privatization of religion, etc. But capitalism as freedom could not have come about strictly through reflection upon nature and the divine or its absence. It had rather to contemplate freedom in society per se, and it had to do so, quote unquote, scientifically. This is in a sense the definition of philosophy for Hegel. That Smith's thought is inadequate to modern capitalism is, so to speak, our problem, not his. That's it. Then, with the labor theory of value in Smith, there comes a profound identification with the working class. The whole system, as far as Smith is concerned, is only justified in terms of the well-being of the workers. Makes the point over and over and over again of the workers. It's not justified in terms of profits. In fact, he thinks that a healthier society is a society of lower profits. He thinks the most advanced societies have the lowest profits. He thinks that capitalism is justified in terms of the, above all, the consumption that it allows, the freedom from scarcity that it allows to the mass of workers, and because it's founded upon freedom. Freedom in the sense, in the famous example of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, that you are not dependent, but not only that you are not dependent, not only that you are free from, but that you are free to. That you are, in fact, neither of those things, that that's not the way to think about liberal freedom at all, but rather to think of it as an integral whole that is born out of the that is the fact that you have your own time, you have to decide what you are going to do with your life. It's why with the rise of bourgeois society, you get novels like Moll Flanders that are about working people, about the commonest people, And the discovery, Daniel Defoe's almost euphoric discovery, not of who Moll Flanders is, but of what she is, which is freedom. She can become this, she can become that, she can seem, she can be, right? In a way that is simply not been available in the past. And so it's not more than a figure of speech to say that proletarian labor could be more unfree than peasant labor or a deeper form of slavery. Because in fact, peasant labor is not free at all. There's no comparison, really. The point would be to say that the unfreedom of the proletariat calls into question, in a sense, the way I would put it is that the freedom project of the proletariat is the inheritor of all previous existing class societies. And in that sense, to the extent that it fails, it falls to the level of all previous class societies, namely slavery. That's, in a sense, at the heart of that kind of figure of speech. That in failing to overcome prehistory, humanity remains enslaved. That would be the way I would put it. Yes, Lenin does say that Marxism is built on the inheritance of British political economy and French socialism and German idealism. But that's because Marxism is a criticism of socialism. Socialism, not Marx, socialism, the great socialists of his day, had the explicit aspiration of combining British political economy, French socialism, or rather the inheritance of the French Revolution, it would be the way that they would put that, the Babeufist legacy of the French Revolution, and German idealism. It's in Proudhon, it's explicit. He's trying to write a Hegelian political economy to in a sense, advance the project of the French Revolution. And Marx is a critic of Chartism, a critic of socialism. It's not just growing out of it. Why? Because he wants to see it succeed. Because socialism and Chartism fail. That's the point. They fail because they don't see beyond they are, in a sense, not even at the level of Ricardo, as he says of Proudhon. Proudhon is more deeply invested with human emancipation. I mean, that Ricardo is more deeply invested in human emancipation than Proudhon, who's a vulgar, in many ways, a vulgar intellectual for Marx. And vulgar not in the sense of some, just elitist contempt. Inadequate to the project of working class emancipation. That's the point. Now, so the issue of Smith in the kind of affirmation of labor, he's affirming a society based on the exchange of labor as a form of sociality that is, as I say, a form of freedom. He's not affirming the dignity of labor as such. In fact, for Smith, he thinks that labor is a drag. He thinks that labor is drudgery, for the most part, for most people. And he doesn't really have much of a theory of technology. He doesn't really have much of an industrial conception. But his explanation of labor-saving devices is brilliant. It's a child who's employed doing a horrible task of every time some valve opens, he has to pull a lever. And it's monotonous, and the child wants to play. And so he links the two through, he rigs up some device so that every time the valve opens, it automatically pulls the lever and he goes off and plays. Now, of course, Smith doesn't draw the obvious conclusion, which is that the kid doesn't continue to get paid after that. That his invention becomes the property of the capitalist. But at the heart of the example is the idea that what people are forced to do in labor is not what they want to do, and that they're exercising a lot of ingenuity to get out of it. And so it's not about the affirmation of labor, and I think that that's part of Marx's attraction. That's why Marx, at the beginning of the critique of the Goethe Programme, when the Lassalleans say that all wealth comes from labor, Marx says absolutely not. Wealth comes from nature, the air that we breathe, the water that's as yet uncommodified, all manner of things, and in fact the raw materials and the forces of nature that we harness to produce our wealth are not the function of labor. Right? The problem is that we have a society in which, in order to participate, in order to be social, you have to have a job. That's why the capitalists never quit, which I think is really what Chris was saying about Bill Gates. They never stop working. I used to write business news, and I would ask them, I'd call at 7 o'clock to some CEO to ask, is it really true that such and such and such and such merger is going to happen in the morning? And he'd say yes or no. And then I'd say, what the hell are you doing at the office at 7 o'clock? And he'd say, what the hell else am I going to do? I work 70-hour weeks. I work 80-hour weeks. You know that they do. Why? Because there's a prevailing ideology that your life has no purpose outside of work. Right? It's actually true in the sense that there is a malaise, there is a social disintegration that takes place amongst the unemployed. Right? It's not the case that you've just got a lot of free time, that you're just born into retirement. To work. Capital posits all of humanity as the ability to labor, and yet denies most of humanity that opportunity. That's why humanity doesn't appear in the word capital. What appears is labor power. Humanity is labor power. What is labor power? It's the ability to have your time absorbed into the labor process. So in that sense, the question isn't just one of the affirmation of labor, it's the overcoming of labor in favor of free human activity. Capitalism and freedom. The issue of proletarianization that I've tried to emphasize is not just one of the promise of, in a sense, political freedom. It's not just liberty, equality, and fraternity, or rather it does get to something about fraternity. Proletarianization, a part of the critique of Adam Smith is an internal critique of the Whig Revolution. He thinks that the Whig Revolution, the British Revolution, believes that all of Europe is sunk in slavery, that they're all just hopelessly subject to popery and Catholicism and absolutism and this and that. And Adam Smith says, that's ridiculous. That might have worked for a little while, but really, what's happening in France looks a lot like what's happening here. And there's a form of freedom there that doesn't have an adequate state expression, doesn't have an adequate political, legal expression, and undoubtedly Smith would have been in favor of the French Revolution. to bring that about, but that there's a freedom enjoyed by people who have there's a freedom enjoyed by the proletarian class as such, to the extent that they subsist as the proletarian class. Obviously, to the extent that they have a job. These people, to get to Marx's point, Smith and Ricardo, they have no reason to believe in the necessity of welfare. They believe that the world is full of human needs, unmet. That the only way to meet them is through putting more and more people to work and increasing more and more the productivity of the working class. They don't have a concept of industrial society. Ricardo's beginning to have one. Marx has one very emphatically, which is that the working class as free is a huge problem for the working class as free, because everybody needs a job. Industrialism is not a technological fact. It grows out of proletarianization. It grows out of that social fact. I heard it said earlier in the week, unfortunately he's not here, that the section on the working day is not a part of the dialectical exposition of capital. It's central, because history is giving rise to a dialectical social form, and the emergence of the extraction of absolute, what Marx calls absolute surplus value, of lengthening the day more and more and more, giving rise, yes, to a form of opposition that isn't immaterial. It is material. It is human beings. It is of people who go to sleep. That constitutes capital as a new social form. That at the heart of industrialization, at the heart of what Marx calls relative surplus value, is the demand for the limitation of the working day. In other words, at the heart of capital is the struggle for productivity and leisure time. But the working class, that at the heart of what Marx calls proletarian political economy, of the demand for the 10-hour day, is to raise the question of how little can we work and how much can we have. If 10 hours, why not 8? Why not 6? Why not 4? Why not 2? And in fact, it's driving capital. It's driving industrialization, the self-organization of the working class. Technology is not some separate fact. And the contradictions of labor with itself are actually working themselves in and through the factory, which Marx describes as two things. Both the ultimate engine ever designed for subjecting humanity to capitalism, and the most glorious labor-saving device ever devised. Which is why he opens the chapter on industrialism with John Stuart Mill scratching his head, saying, how come all these machines never seem to have emancipated humanity from a single day's labor? Some of these I may have to come back to.
I'll bring him in at the end if you want to.
Let me just respond briefly to Mark. New leftists who are anti-bureaucratic, people who don't want to live in the Fordist state, and who are demanding wage labor on your telling, are not exactly the same thing as proletarians, or in a sense, the original form of proletarianization. And the issue of being conscious of one's own exploitation and one's own alienation in Marx, it's not that Marx goes beyond Smith, it's that Marx is predicated on Smith. You're not going to experience your exploitation and your alienation until you're free. Peasants do not experience exploitation and alienation. They experience the fact of their birth. And any deviation, any time that they rise up, They simply are attempting to restore the tradition that allows for the endless performance of these forms of labor, the endless form of this form of exploitation. Right? It doesn't call into question the social order. So that, in that sense, the emancipation that is grasped and celebrated by liberalism is at the heart of the experience of alienation. It's actually, alienation is a recognition that what's ultimately dominating you is you. What's ultimately dominating labor is dead labor, is capital. When Marx says there's a dialectic of living in dead labor, he means the working class has a freedom problem. That's what he means. Yasmin, I don't think I can...
Well, I'll bring you back from...
I will answer your question when I come back. Unemployment in those societies, the mass unemployment in most of the peripheral world, can only be explained by the existence of capitalism. Right? And this is, I think, Chris's point with reference to Africa. It's not a question, in other words, of boosterism for American imperialism viewed as this extension of capitalism. Capitalism exists. There's no place, there's no ticket you can buy from any travel agent that's going to take you to the pre-capitalist world today. So the issue of putting the blame for the rise of Islamism on the left is one of, which is the larger point that I'm trying to make, which is that the left must take responsibility for history as a whole. That to say that this is working class's freedom problem is to say that the price of failing to solve it is fascism. The price of failing to solve it is disintegration. The price of failing to solve it is regression. That's the largest sense that I'm saying. So that at the heart of Islamism is Stalinism, would be the point that I would make. That's not to say, I completely agree. If you live in 1979, I would take up the Spartacist line. I'd say this is the Russian question point blank. You support the Russians against the Mujahideen funded by the CIA. It's a clear issue politically. There's no question about that. But the real question is, not capitalism or Stalinism. The point is that the left only delivered a project of modernization, of Stalinist progress. That's the real point. If you go back to Marx, to the, in a sense, rise of modern Islamism, the first point in which Allahu Akbar is raised explicitly against the modern capitalist world, it's the Indian Rebellion of 1857. And what Marx is saying there is that to the extent that this society fails to fulfill its own potential, it renounces the claim to rationally supersede feudalism. That the supersession of feudalism, and this is my point, it's not about defending the liberalism that exists, it's about understanding that liberalism tasks socialism. It issues out of it directly. It's not anti-liberal. That's why I say it's the sneer in the phrase bourgeois political economy that you hear through the 20th century when people talk about it, is the deepest instinct of Stalinism. Because it's about renouncing that project of inheriting liberalism. So yes, and this is why, by the way, Marx treats post-1848 expansion of capitalism as a very different thing. As a blood-soaked, bloody-minded, explicitly murderous, which is the way he describes 1857, that no law of nation or law of war could explain the way that the British troops behaved in 1857. And he sees that as an expression of the rot of what he calls Bonapartism. Now that rot, that liberalism, that statification of society, that authoritarianism, gives rise to the core periphery issues of the 1880s and 90s and the Berlin Conference. So that the question is one of the evolution of Bonapartism into the imperialism described by Lenin. It's not a separate issue. It's not word changing meaning. It's history developing. That's the point with reference to imperialism. It's the unresolved problem at the core that is the issue. The deepest, and it is a profoundly Eurocentric argument. It's a profoundly Eurocentric argument. The greatest event in the history of the modern peripheral world is the non-revolution in its core. That is what you have to understand post-1848. To understand the further development of India, to understand the dynamics even of the Chinese Revolution. Sorry. Just briefly, I mean, Chris was accused of presenting a mutilated Marx. I think a Marx that relativizes the significance of capital in favor of an unpublished manuscript that Marx said was rightly confined to the criticism of the mice, namely the German ideology, which I actually think is a great book and can be read in a very different way than as simply outlining Marx's philosophy of history in terms of successive modes of production, which I actually think has nothing to do with it. I think the book from beginning to end is a polemic against the young Hegelians. I think that is a very mutilated Marx. Capital is Marx's life work. It is after the failure of 1848, after Marx and Engels deciding that revolution was over, Engels writes to Marx, and he says, thank God we can wash our hands of those fucking comrades that we had to deal with for all of those days, who never understood and were as much our enemies as our friends. Just wait till they read your political economy. That's what Engels says. The critique of political economy is a critique of even the members of the Communist League. That's the way Engels understands it. It is the work. It is the work that breaks Marx's health, and for which he tests his friendship with Engels to the utmost, to say you need to support me for this work. And it's a work that generates the great mass of his writings. To say that can be relativized in favor of an argument about the German ideology and the anti-Düring is, to me, very, very suspect. I don't know what we have by Karl Marx if we don't have Capital. Is rioting a petty bourgeois attitude, etc.? I mean, obviously rioting is an expression of the disintegration of capitalism. Obviously people who have jobs and who don't want to see the world disintegrate to the point that they don't have those jobs, that are committed to having they're having those jobs, and their potential trade union organization has a potential that rioting doesn't have. That's what I would say.
I was meaning that the people who criticize the rioters, were condemning the rioters, they have a petty bourgeois attitude.
Well, I'm saying that I don't know what...
Not the rioters.
We may have a disagreement on that. I would...
Is it because the working class are bought into the system, that even though, you're saying it's obvious, like in that feudal society, it wasn't obvious, but in the capitalist society, the working class are aware of exploitation, but the British working class, they buy into the system of the hierarchy, the king, the royalty, etc.
Sure.
So, is it just because of false consciousness? Because they all have a desire that they're going to make a dream, they're going to get wealthy? And is the media...
Discuss it over the lunch.
Yeah, I guess I would simply say that there is, and this is at the heart of the Frankfurt School, that authoritarianism works itself out at the level of personality, at the level of subjectivity, that the level at which people have ceased not only to think about human emancipation beyond capitalism, but that their psychology bears the scars of that to a large degree, and they can't even participate in the society that exists. There's a profound desire to destroy it and to tear it down, and that has to be seen in the riots. It's not a question of whether you're condemning them or not. It's whether you're reading them as a symptom of the kind of social situation that we're in. And that's a very different thing than cheerleading a judge's decision to put one or another person in prison. Right? That's what I would say, is that the issue, that there's a profound authoritarianism expressed in the rioters, not just in the response of the state and of the ruling class. Pre-modern societies are all alike. I mean, the quote that Mark read out is precisely that, to the extent that you recognize yourself as a human and you're bringing about a world that confirms that humanity, which is the second point, which a peasant revolt does not do. To the extent that you do that, you're not a slave. Obviously, we have the historical experience of slavery coming to an end. Slaves can recognize that they're slaves and put it to an end. It's called capitalism. Right? That's the recognition that gave rise to it. It also means that you're not going to do. It's not just that the peasant is exploited by the Lord and the church. It's that the peasant performs peasant labor. The peasant is a peasant. That's what he knows to do. He has an existential relationship to the plow and to the draft horse. He's born to that relationship, just as the Lord has an existential relation to the horse and to the sword. It's a relationship to nature. It's not just an issue of being exploited. Right? And that's why, it's only to the extent that the peasant is imagining the end of his peasant condition that you can talk about a revolt becoming a bourgeois revolution. As for Moïse Pistone and Hillel Tickton and Antonio Negri and so forth, I see no reason for me to be churlish with respect to my teachers. I learned a lot from Moïse Pistone, but what I'm saying is not what he says. I would argue that Pistone and Negri have a great deal more in common than the way that you put it is imagining. Pistone imagines that there's going to be a recognition on the part of the working class that they don't have to work anymore, that this work is unnecessary, and that they're somehow going to bring about the end of capitalism on the basis of that recognition. As is right.
Pistone says that, or Negri?
Yeah, Pistone says that, and Pistone ties that to a whole argument in favor of the new social movements, which Hillel Tickton is right to point out has roots in anarchism. I agree with Hillel to that extent. I think that Antonio Negri has roots in anarchism. The difference with American slavery is that American slaves are being asked to do capitalist labor. Pre-modern slavery, the labor doesn't change. Capitalist slavery is, the labor process itself is changing all the time. They're being treated as wage laborers in essence. They're being expected to perform a rapidly changing form. And of course, the cotton gin itself is being imposed upon a slave laboring population. Nothing of the sort ever happened under Roman slavery. It's a completely different thing. People, they're basically being worked to death in Mississippi. They're being bred in Virginia and North Carolina in order to be worked to death in Mississippi and Alabama, according to tables that the pseudo-feudal capitalists of the American South have figured out. Okay, at this point, an adult male black man becomes less and less productive. We can work them if they're all dying around age 40. That's okay. That's in a sense ideal. That's the way that labor is coming to be performed as the industrial agricultural process that feeds the industrial mills of Great Britain. There's no comparison between that slavery as a practice and the slavery of the society of what I'm calling of estates, of pre-modern civilization, in which slavery is an estate, and I pointed out in a previous session, you can even be a slave king in many places. I guess I'll have to... as for the negation of philosophy, and this is the last point, the issue is not one of stopping doing philosophy. The issue is negating the condition that requires this philosophy. As I said, that philosophy post-Hegel, post-German idealism, is the thought of the unfreedom that freedom produces. The unfreedom that our practices produce, the unfreedom at bottom of going to work for Marx. Going to work is the reconstitution of a society based on value. And it cannot be solved by not going to work, which is what Negri thinks. That's what Marx calls the commodity form. To end philosophy is to end the society that requires philosophy. To end the society based on the commodity form.
Oh, thank you.